The rain that fell on the day we buried my grandfather wasn't the gentle, sorrowful drizzle you see in the movies. It was a bitter, freezing sleet that bit into your skin and made the world feel entirely unforgiving. I stood a few feet back from the open grave, my black wool coat heavy with moisture, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to hide their trembling. I was exhausted. A bone-deep, soul-crushing kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a few sleepless nights, but from a decade of slowly giving your life away to keep someone else alive. My name is Vionne Marlowe. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. Across the freshly dug earth stood my parents, Caspiel and Alaris. They looked like they had stepped out of a magazine spread on upscale grieving. My father's bespoke Italian suit was perfectly tailored, shielded from the sleet by a massive golf umbrella held by an assistant. My mother dabbed at perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief, her designer morning hat tilted at exactly the right angle to catch the sympathetic glances of the old money elite who had gathered to pay their respects. They hadn't visited in 3 years. While they were wintering in Aspen and attending charity galas in New York, I was here, in the sprawling, echoing halls of the Marlowe estate in Connecticut. I gave up my career, my relationship, and my 30s to change adult diapers, manage a rotating schedule of in-home nurses, administer medications at 2 a.m., and hold the frail, trembling hand of Talon Marlowe as his mind and body slowly betrayed him. I was 42 years old, but standing by that grave, my knees aching and my heart hollowed out, I felt 80. When the service finally concluded, my mother glided over to me. She didn't hug me. She never hugged me if it risked wrinkling her clothes. "You look dreadful, darling," she murmured, her voice a soft velvet blade. "We're heading back to the house to host the reception. Do try to freshen up. The Whitmans are coming, and you know how they talk." She turned and walked toward the waiting black Lincoln town car before I could form a response. I didn't have the energy to fight. I just wanted to go to my room, take off my damp shoes, and sleep for a week. But the nightmare was only just beginning. The reception was a blur of polite condolences from people who didn't actually know my grandfather, only his net worth. I stayed in the background, serving tea, clearing plates, ghosting through the grand mahogany library and the sitting rooms of the estate I had maintained for a decade. By 8 p.m., the last guest had finally departed. The massive oak front doors clicked shut, and the sudden silence in the house was deafening. I began gathering the discarded crystal glasses, craving the solitude of my bedroom, when my father's voice rang out from the library. "Come in here. We need to discuss logistics." I set the tray down and walked into the room. The library was my grandfather's sanctuary, lined with first editions and smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. My father was standing by the fireplace, pouring himself a generous measure of 20-year-old scotch. My mother was seated on the leather Chesterfield sofa, carefully removing her pearl earrings. "Logistics?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Can't this wait until tomorrow? We just buried him." Caspiel took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes cold and assessing over the rim of the crystal glass. "Tomorrow I have a flight to catch. Time is money, and we have a lot to sort out. Sit down." I didn't sit. I crossed my arms, suddenly acutely aware of how small I felt in this massive room. "Where is Mr. Harrison? If you're talking about the estate, shouldn't the family lawyer be here to read the will?" My mother let out a soft, breathy laugh that made my stomach churn. "Oh, darling, there's no need to drag Harrison into this tonight. Your father and I have already handled the preliminary paperwork with our own legal counsel." Caspiel set his glass down on the mantel and picked up a manila folder. He opened it, pulling out a crisp, newly printed document. "Your grandfather's mind was slipping, as you well know. Over the last year, he made some irrational decisions. Thankfully, before he passed, we managed to get an updated, notarized directive. It overrides any previous wills." The air in the room seemed to vanish. "What are you talking about?" I stepped forward. "I was his medical proxy. I was with him every single day. He didn't sign anything with you. He couldn't even hold a pen last month." "Careful," my father warned, his tone dropping into a dangerous baritone. "We have witnesses and a notary who will swear he was of sound mind when he signed this over to us 6 weeks ago during our brief visit. The estate, the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, everything transfers directly to me. As his only son, it's the natural order of things." I stared at him, the realization washing over me like ice water. The brief visit he was talking about was a Tuesday afternoon when I had gone to the pharmacy to pick up morphine. They had been alone with him for exactly 45 minutes. "You forced him," I whispered, the horror creeping up my throat. "You brought a lawyer into his bedroom while he was heavily medicated, and you forced him to sign." We protected the family legacy, my mother corrected smoothly, crossing her legs. You've been isolated in this gloomy house for 10 years. You've lost touch with reality. You thought just because you played nursemaid, you were entitled to the Marlowe empire? I didn't want an empire, I snapped, tears of frustration finally pricking my eyes. I wanted to take care of him because you two abandoned him. I sacrificed my life for him. You hid, Caspiel sneered, dropping the civilized facade. You failed in your marketing career, your fiancé left you, and you ran back here to hide under an old man's roof. You lived rent-free. You ate his food. You drove his cars. You were a freeloader masking as a martyr. The words hit me like physical blows. Every sleepless night, every time I carried my grandfather to the bathroom when he was too weak to walk, every time he cried because he missed his son who never called, all of it was being twisted into a narrative of my own selfishness. The house is going on the market next week, my father continued, tossing the document back onto the desk. The real estate agents are coming tomorrow morning to take staging photos. We can't have your clutter everywhere. What are you saying? I asked, my voice barely audible. We are saying it is time for you to grow up, my mother said, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You need to move out. Tonight. Tonight? I gasped, stepping back as if the floor had tilted. It's freezing outside. It's past 9 o'clock. Where am I supposed to go? That is exactly the problem, my father sighed, looking at me with absolute disgust. You're 42 years old and you have nowhere to go. We'll give you a severance, of course, $2,000 to help you get on your feet. Consider it back pay for your caregiving, but you are not sleeping in this house tonight. Pack a bag. The security company will be here in an hour to change the locks and set the alarms. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. There was no love in their eyes. There wasn't even pity. There was only greed and the annoyance of dealing with an obstacle they had finally managed to sweep aside. They had planned this. For months, maybe years, they had waited for the old man to die so they could swoop in, steal the crown, and throw me out into the snow. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. 10 years of dealing with life and death had stripped me of the energy for theatrical hysterics. I turned on my heel and walked out of the library. I marched up the sweeping staircase to my bedroom, the room I had lived in since I was a little girl. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely pull my suitcase from the closet. I didn't pack the expensive dresses my mother had bought me years ago for family portraits. I packed jeans, heavy sweaters, my boots, and the few pieces of jewelry that I had bought with my own money before I gave up my career. Before I left the room, I stopped by my bedside table. I opened the small drawer and reached to the very back. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled it out. It was a rusted, heavy brass key. 4 days before he died, my grandfather had a rare moment of terrifying clarity. He had gripped my hand with a strength I didn't know he had left. He pressed this key into my palm, his breathing ragged and shallow. Your grandmother, he had wheezed, his eyes wide and frantic. Brisea knew. She always knew what Caspiel was. I was a coward. I let them take too much. Don't let them win. Cumberland Trust, Box 402. He had slipped back into unconsciousness a minute later and never woke up. At the time, I thought it was the morphine talking, the delirium of a dying man clinging to the memory of his late wife. But standing in my room, listening to the muffled, triumphant laughter of my parents downstairs, the key felt like a physical anchor in a world that was spinning out of control. I zipped my suitcase shut. I slipped the brass key into the deep pocket of my wool coat. When I walked downstairs, the security technicians were already at the front door. My father was handing them a check. He didn't even look at me as I walked past him, dragging my suitcase across the marble foyer. Leave the keys to the Range Rover on the console, my mother called out from the living room. It's company property. I unclipped the car key from my ring and dropped it onto the silver tray by the door. It landed with a loud, final clatter. I walked out into the freezing sleet, and the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. The lock clicked. I had exactly $2,000 transferred to my checking account, a suitcase of old clothes, and my beat-up 12-year-old Honda Civic that I had kept parked behind the garage for emergencies. The engine whined in protest as I turned the ignition, the heater blasting cold air into my face. I drove away from the estate without looking back in the rearview mirror. By midnight, I was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in a $40 a night motel off the interstate. The neon sign outside my window flickered, casting harsh red shadows across the stained carpet. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and damp bleach. I sat there in my damp coat, staring at the peeling wallpaper. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the house was fading, leaving behind a terrifying, gaping void. I had no job, no home, no references for a resume, and a family that had just casually destroyed my life for their own convenience. I pulled my knees to my chest, and for the first time since my grandfather took his last breath, I cried. I wept for the man who had raised me, the only person in that cold family who had ever looked at me with genuine warmth. I wept for the 10 years I had lost, the wrinkles around my eyes, the gray hairs I hadn't had the time to dye. I cried until my throat burned and my eyes were swollen shut. But eventually the tears stopped. They always do. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out the heavy brass key and laid it on the cheap veneer of the motel nightstand. Cumberland Trust, Box 402. My parents thought I was weak. They thought because I chose compassion over ambition, because I chose changing a dying man's bedsheets over attending cocktail parties, that I was stupid. They thought they had buried me along with my grandfather. I stared at the key, feeling a strange, unfamiliar heat rising in my chest. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was rage, a slow-burning, icy rage that crystallized my spine and sharpened my mind. I wasn't going to crawl away and disappear. I was going to find out exactly what my grandmother Bricia had left behind. And if my parents wanted a war over the Marlowe legacy, I was going to give them one they would never forget. The morning light that filtered through the cheap motel blinds was gray and unforgiving. I woke up with a stiff neck, the damp chill of the room having seeped into my bones overnight. For a brief, disorienting second, I expected to hear the faint beep of my grandfather's oxygen machine down the hall. I expected to smell the sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and lavender. Instead, the roar of an 18-wheeler downshifting on the interstate rattled the thin glass of the window, bringing the brutal reality of my new life crashing down on me. I was 42. I was homeless. I was entirely alone. I forced myself out of the sagging bed, splashed freezing water on my face in the rusted bathroom sink, and put on the same jeans and heavy wool coat from the night before. I didn't bother with makeup. There was no one left to impress. I grabbed the brass key from the nightstand, its weight a cold reminder of the only task I had left, and walked out to my car. Cumberland Trust was located in the affluent heart of downtown, a fortress of limestone columns, polished marble floors, and hushed conversations. It was the kind of bank where the tellers wore tailored suits and knew their clients' golf handicaps. As I walked through the heavy revolving doors, catching my reflection in the glass, I looked glaringly out of place. My coat was wrinkled, my hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and I carried the exhaustion of a 10-year war on my face. "May I help you, ma'am?" a security guard asked, stepping slightly into my path as if anticipating I was there to ask to use the restroom. "I need to access a safety deposit box," I said, my voice coming out raspier than I intended. "Box 402. The guard's expression shifted marginally. He pointed me toward a mahogany desk at the far end of the lobby. Sitting behind it was Arthur Pendleton, the branch manager. Arthur was a fixture in my family's periphery, a man who had attended my parents' holiday parties for years, always lingering near my father with a sycophantic smile, eager to manage the lucrative Marlowe accounts. When Arthur looked up and saw me, his eyes widened slightly before smoothing into an expression of practiced professional sympathy. "Vion, my dear," Arthur said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "I was utterly devastated to hear about Tallon. He was a titan, truly. I assumed you would be resting at the estate today." He knew exactly what he was doing. His eyes flicked over my unkempt appearance, categorizing my distress. Arthur was a man who traded in information. "I'm not at the estate, Arthur," I said evenly, pulling the brass key from my pocket and placing it on his pristine desk. "I need to access my grandfather's box. Number 402. Arthur stared at the key, a brief flash of something unreadable. Surprise, panic, crossing his face. He quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Of course. Though I must mention, Caspiel called me first thing this morning regarding the transfer of Tallon's primary accounts. I wasn't aware Tallon had retained an independent box. Let me just check the authorization protocols." He typed rapidly on his keyboard, his jaw ticking. I watched him closely. My grandfather had explicitly told me to come here, which meant this box was hidden even from my father. Yes," Arthur murmured, clearing his throat. "It appears Tallon listed you as the sole co-signer on this specific vault 15 years ago. Right this way, Vion." He led me down a spiral staircase into the quiet, climate-controlled vault. The air smelled of old metal and filtered dust. Arthur unlocked the master panel, allowed me to turn my brass key, and slid a heavy, elongated steel box from the wall. He offered to carry it to a private viewing room, his eyes lingering on the metal lid with obvious curiosity, but I took it from him. "I'd like to be alone, Arthur. Thank you." He hesitated, a forced smile plastered on his face. "Take all the time you need, Vion." And when the door of the private viewing room clicked shut, leaving me in absolute silence, my hands began to shake again. I sat down at the small desk, took a deep breath, and popped the latch on the box. There were no stacks of cash. There were no bearer bonds or sparkling family heirlooms. Inside lay 3 thick, perfectly organized binders of audit reports, a weathered, leather-bound journal, and a single crisp, cream-colored business card resting on top. I picked up the card, Harrison Vance, Esquire, Trust and Estate Law. Underneath the card was the leather journal. The initials B.M. were embossed in gold on the bottom right corner. Bricia Marlowe, my grandmother. She had passed away from a sudden aneurysm 12 years ago, 2 years before my grandfather's health began its slow, agonizing decline. She was a quiet, fiercely intelligent woman who preferred reading Financial Times over attending my mother's country club luncheons. I opened the journal. The first page contained a single line, written in her elegant, sweeping cursive, "For Vion, when the wolves come." My breath hitched in my throat. I turned the pages, skimming through years of meticulous, handwritten notes. They weren't diary entries about her feelings, they were ledgers. Records of offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and detailed chronologies of my father's catastrophic business failures that she had quietly bailed out. October 14th. Caspiel has defaulted on the commercial real estate loan in Chicago. Tallinn wants to cover it to save the family name. I have refused. If we hand him the keys to the kingdom, he will burn it down to keep his wife in diamonds. I am restructuring the trust. My grandmother had known. She had seen right through my parents' polished veneer of success. She knew Caspiel was incompetent, and she knew Alaris was driven by insatiable greed, and she knew, somehow, that they would eventually come for me. I spent the next hour photographing every single page of the journal and every audit report on my phone. When I finally closed the box and left the bank, I felt a strange sense of armor forming around me. I wasn't fighting an invisible ghost anymore. I had my grandmother's ghost standing right beside me. I drove to a small diner a few miles from the bank to buy a cheap cup of coffee and figure out how to contact Harrison Vance. I slid into a vinyl booth, ordered a black drip coffee, and pulled out my laptop. I had just connected to the diner's spotty Wi-Fi when a shadow fell across my table. I looked up. A man in a plain gray windbreaker was standing over me. "Vion Marlowe?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, instinctively pulling my laptop closer. "You've been served," he said flatly, dropping a thick manila envelope onto the table before turning and walking swiftly out the diner door. I stared at the envelope. My heart began to hammer a frantic, sickening rhythm against my ribs. I tore it open, pulling out a stack of legal documents bearing the seal of the state family court. I read the bold heading on the first page, and the diner around me seemed to tilt violently on its axis. Petition for injunctive relief and damages. Plaintiffs: Caspiel Marlowe, Alaris Marlowe. Defendant: Vion Marlowe. Charges: elder abuse, medical neglect, financial exploitation, and undue influence. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I forced my eyes to read the paragraphs underneath. My parents weren't just suing me. They were systematically assassinating my character. The petition claimed that I had intentionally isolated my grandfather, withheld his medications to induce cognitive decline, and attempted to coerce him into signing his estate over to me. They were asking the court to permanently bar me from contesting their new will, demanding I pay back misappropriated funds I allegedly stole for living expenses, and requesting the case be forwarded to the district attorney for criminal charges. They had weaponized my 10 years of sacrifice. They were going to paint me as a monster to the world, ensuring no lawyer would touch me, no employer would hire me, and no judge would ever listen to a word I said. I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to tear out of my throat. It was a masterclass in cruelty. It wasn't enough to throw me out into the snow. They needed to bury me alive so they could dance on the grave of my reputation, completely unbothered, while they spent my grandfather's fortune. Panic, hot and blinding, surged through me. But then I looked down at my open bag. I saw the edge of Brisia's leather journal poking out. When the wolves come. The wolves were here. I threw a $5 bill on the table, grabbed my things, and practically ran to my car. I typed the address from Harrison Vance's business card into my GPS. Harrison Vance's law firm occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass high-rise. Walking into his lobby felt like stepping into an immaculate, intimidating corporate cathedral. I approached the receptionist, my knuckles white as I gripped the strap of my bag. "I need to see Harrison Vance," I said. "My name is Vionne Marlowe." The receptionist blinked, her eyes darting to her computer screen. "Do you have an appointment, Ms. Marlowe?" "No, but it is a matter of absolute urgency." "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance's schedule is entirely full for the next month. I can perhaps see if a junior associate—" "I am not leaving this lobby until I speak to him," I interrupted, my voice sharp, carrying a command I didn't know I possessed. Before she could call security, a set of heavy glass doors opened, and a man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out. He was in his mid-50s, with silvering hair at his temples and the exhausted, calculating eyes of a man who spent his life navigating the treacherous waters of the ultra-rich. He paused, looking at me. "Ms. Marlowe?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Are you Harrison Vance?" "I am. Come into my office." He led me down a long hallway lined with abstract art and ushered me into a massive corner office overlooking the city. He didn't offer me a drink. He sat behind his desk, steeled his hands, and looked at me with a mixture of professional detachment and weary pity. "I know why you're here, Ms. Marlowe, and I'm going to save us both a great deal of time," Harrison said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I received an alert on the court docket 2 hours ago. I saw the petition your father filed against you." "It's a lie," I said, my voice shaking with raw indignation. "Every single word of it is a fabricated, malicious lie. I gave up my life for my grandfather. They abandoned him." "I believe you," Harrison said simply. The unexpected validation nearly made my knees buckle. "But belief doesn't win in probate or family court, Ms. Marlowe. Paperwork does. Your father has boundless resources, the best litigators in the state on retainer, and a narrative that is notoriously difficult to disprove. Defending against an elder abuse claim will take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money I assume you no longer have access to. I do not take cases I cannot win, and I do not take cases pro bono. I'm sorry." He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This was the moment. If I walked out of this office, Caspiel and Elarius won. I would be a convicted felon, ruined and destitute, while they uncorked champagne in the house I had kept warm for a decade. "You're right," I said, unzipping my bag. "I don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars, but my grandmother did." Harrison frowned, pausing halfway to the door. "Brisea Marlowe has been dead for 12 years. "Yes," I said. I pulled the leather journal and the stack of audit reports from my bag. I slammed them down onto his polished mahogany desk. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet office. "But she left me a roadmap," I said, looking him dead in the eye. I opened the journal to the inside cover and flipped to the back of the audit reports. Stamped onto the heavy parchment was a distinct deep red wax seal, a complex crest featuring a falcon clutching a coin. Harrison Vance froze. He stared at the seal, all the color draining from his face. He slowly reached out, his fingers hovering over the crest as if he were looking at a ghost. "I haven't seen this seal in over a decade," he murmured, his voice entirely stripped of its previous corporate detachment. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, calculating, and suddenly very, very sharp. "Where did you get this?" "Box 402 at Cumberland Trust," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "My grandfather told me to find it before he died. He said Brisea knew what my father was. She knew this day would come." Harrison sank back into his leather chair, staring at the documents. A slow, dangerous smile began to spread across his face. It wasn't the smile of a polite corporate lawyer. It was the smile of a predator who had just been handed a loaded weapon. "Brisea Marlowe was the most brilliant, terrifying woman I have ever had the privilege of representing," Harrison said softly. He looked up at me, his demeanor entirely transformed. The dismissal was gone. In its place was an intense, fiery respect. "Miss Marlowe," Harrison said, leaning forward and resting his arms on the desk, "your parents think they've buried you. They think they've won the war before it even started. But if these documents are what I think they are," he picked up the journal, tracing the embossed initials. "We aren't just going to defend you against their petition. Harrison said, his eyes locking onto mine. We are going to dismantle Caspiel and Alaris Marlowe piece by piece. We are going to burn their empire to the ground. I felt a fierce, terrifying thrill shoot down my spine. I nodded slowly. Good, I said. Where do we start? Harrison Vance did not waste a single second. He picked up his desk phone, hit a speed dial button, and waited exactly 2 rings before speaking. Eleanor, clear your schedule for the next 48 hours. Bring your decryption software and an empty hard drive to my office. We have a ghost to chase. He hung up without waiting for a response and turned his piercing gaze back to me. Ms. Marlowe, if you are going to war against Caspiel, you need to understand that the battlefield is not fought with emotions. It is fought with numbers, and there is no one in this state who speaks that language better than Eleanor Sterling. 15 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of Harrison's office swung open. Eleanor Sterling strode in, carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war zone. She was a woman in her late 40s, wearing a sharp navy blazer, her dark hair cropped into a no-nonsense bob, and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified a pair of intensely calculating gray eyes. She was a forensic accountant, the kind of professional high-powered law firms called in when they needed to find money that wealthy people had paid millions of dollars to hide. Harrison, Eleanor said briskly, dropping her briefcase onto the conference table. She didn't offer small talk. She turned to me, offering a firm, brief handshake. Eleanor Sterling, you must be Vion. I read the elder abuse petition Caspiel filed against you on my way up in the elevator. It's a beautifully formatted piece of fiction. Now, show me what you have to counter it. I carefully slid Brisea's leather journal and the audit reports across the table. Eleanor's eyes zeroed in on the deep red wax seal, the falcon clutching a coin. For a fraction of a second, the impenetrable armor of the forensic accountant cracked. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Brisea Marlowe, she whispered, her voice laced with a reverence I hadn't expected. I studied the Marlowe Trust restructuring in my graduate seminars. It's considered a masterpiece of financial fortification. They say she built a labyrinth so complex the IRS spent 3 years auditing it and ended up owing her money. Eleanor opened the journal and began to flip through the pages. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the crisp sound of parchment turning. Harrison poured 3 glasses of water, silently sliding one toward me. My hands were still shaking slightly, the adrenaline of the morning beginning to crash, but I forced myself to sit perfectly straight. I was homeless, living out of a suitcase in a $40 motel, but in this room, I was Brisea Marlowe's granddaughter. I had to act like it. This is incredible, Eleanor murmured, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Caspiel has been acting as the face of the Marlowe Empire for a decade. But according to Brisea's private ledgers, he never actually had his hands on the wheel. She knew he was a liability. Look at this entry from 12 years ago. Caspiel treats the family holdings like a personal ATM. I have transferred the core voting shares of the holding company into a blind trust. Eleanor looked up, her gray eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. Vion, your parents are living on a massive, highly leveraged line of credit. They think they inherited the kingdom when your grandfather died, but what they actually inherited is the facade. The true wealth, the real estate portfolio, the tech patents, the voting rights, is locked behind a series of proxy corporations your grandmother set up. And they need me out of the way to break the proxy. I realized, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with sickening clarity. That's why they forged a new will. That's why they threw me out into the snow. If I contest the new will, the court will freeze the assets and look under the hood. They can't afford an audit. Exactly, Harrison said, his voice a low rumble, which brings us to their immediate strategy, the elder abuse petition. It is a preemptive strike. In the state of Connecticut, if you are found guilty of elder abuse, financial exploitation, or medical neglect, the Slayer statute can be applied civilly. You would be automatically disinherited and permanently stripped of your legal standing to contest any probate matters. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. They want to make me a monster, so the judge throws my case out before I can even point out the fraud. And they are pushing for a swift execution, Harrison noted, checking his email on a tablet. I just received a notice from your father's attorney, Bradley Pierce. They are demanding an emergency mediation session tomorrow morning. They want to offer you a deal. A deal? I scoffed, the bitterness rising in my throat. Let me guess. I sign away my right to contest the fake will, and they graciously drop the fake criminal charges against me? That is exactly the play, Harrison confirmed. He set his tablet down and leaned forward, his silver eyes locking onto mine. Vion, they are relying on your exhaustion. They know you have spent 10 years caring for a dying man. They know you have no money, no home, and no support system. They expect you to walk into that mediation room tomorrow, terrified of going to prison, and sign your birthright away just to make the nightmare stop. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a caregiver. The skin was dry from endless hand washing, the nails cut short and unpolished. For 10 years, these hands had bathed Talon Marlowe, crushed his pills into applesauce, and held him when the dementia made him terrified of the dark. My parents had spent those 10 years drinking champagne on yachts, and now they were going to sit in a glass conference room and accuse me of abusing him. The icy rage that had sparked in the motel room suddenly flared into a roaring, uncontrollable fire. What do we need to break their petition? I asked, my voice deadly calm. They need witnesses to prove neglect, Harrison explained. A doctor, a nurse, someone who can testify that you isolated Talon and withheld his care. Do you have any idea who they might have bought? My mind raced back over the last 6 months. The rotating staff of hospice nurses, the late-night emergencies. And then it hit me. Sarah Jenkins, I breathed. Eleanor looked up from her laptop. Who is Sarah Jenkins? She was a night shift intern from the agency. She worked with us for about 3 weeks last month, I explained, the memory crystallizing with perfect, horrifying clarity. She was always asking strange questions about my grandfather's estate, hovering around the library when she was supposed to be monitoring his vitals. I caught her going through his desk drawers and fired her on the spot. But a week later, I saw her driving a brand new Mercedes through town. I remember thinking how a 22-year-old nursing intern could afford a $90,000 car. Harrison's predatory smile returned. She was Caspiel's inside woman. They paid her to fabricate medical logs showing neglect. A payoff disguised as a gift. But it won't hold up, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed a piece of paper and a pen from Harrison's desk. Because Sarah Jenkins was an intern. In the state of Connecticut, an intern's daily charts are invalid unless countersigned by the attending physician. I looked at Harrison, the adrenaline singing in my veins. My grandfather's primary physician was Dr. Alistair Reed. He is the chief of medicine at the county hospital. He visited the estate personally every Friday for the last 4 years. Dr. Reed and I are close friends. He knows exactly how my grandfather was treated. If Caspiel is using Sarah Jenkins's forged logs as the basis for the abuse claim, they are missing the master file. And where is the master file? Eleanor asked, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Dr. Reed keeps the physical originals in his secure archive at the hospital. He's old school. He never trusted digital cloud servers for high-profile patients, I said, standing up. I need to make a phone call. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening more freezing rain. Harrison had refused to let me sleep in the motel. He had used his firm's corporate account to place me in a secure, discreet penthouse suite downtown, complete with a hot shower and a catered dinner. For the first time in days, I felt human. I wore a tailored black suit that Harrison's assistant had procured for me, sharp, professional, and unyielding. When Harrison, Eleanor, and I walked into the mediation center, the air was thick with tension. We were shown into a massive conference room with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the city skyline. Sitting across the long mahogany table were Caspiel and Alaris Marlowe. They looked impeccable, as always. My father wore a navy pinstripe suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, exuding the quiet, dangerous confidence of a man used to getting whatever he wanted. My mother sat beside him in a beige cashmere turtleneck, looking at me with an expression of manufactured pity that made my skin crawl. Flanking them was Bradley Pierce, a slick, aggressive litigator with a predatory grin. As we sat down, my father let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Vion, darling," Caspiel said, his voice dripping with faux sorrow. "You look exhausted. I am so sorry it had to come to this. We never wanted to drag our family's tragedy into the public eye." "Save the performance, Caspiel," Harrison cut in smoothly, opening his leather briefcase. "There is no audience here. Let's get straight to the extortion." Bradley Pierce bristled, leaning forward. "Mr. Vance, we are here as a courtesy. Your client is facing a mountain of evidence proving she systematically abused and exploited Talon Marlowe in his final years. We have sworn affidavits from medical staff detailing the squalid conditions she kept him in, the isolation tactics she used, and her repeated attempts to force him to sign checks. The district attorney is very interested in our file. My mother dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue. It breaks my heart, Vion, to think of what you did to your own grandfather just because you were jealous of our success. I stared at her, my expression entirely blank. A week ago, those words would have shattered me. I would have cried, pleaded, and tried to defend my honor to parents who were inherently deaf to the truth. But today, their manipulation felt entirely hollow. I was looking at two strangers who happened to share my DNA. Pierce slid a thick legal document across the polished mahogany table. It came to a stop directly in front of me. "This is a global settlement and waiver of rights," Pierce said, tapping the document with his expensive fountain pen. "You sign this, irrevocably relinquishing any and all claims to the Marlowe estate, the properties, and the trusts. You agree to walk away cleanly. In exchange, your parents will drop the elder abuse petition and withhold their file from the district attorney. We will even generously provide you with a $50,000 relocation stipend so you can start a new life somewhere else." Pierce leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug, victorious smile. "It's a lifeline, Ms. Marlowe. I suggest you take it, because if you walk out of this room without signing, you will be arrested by Friday." The room fell dead silent. Caspiel watched me, his eyes cold and triumphant. Alaris offered a soft, condescending nod, urging me to surrender. They had orchestrated the perfect trap. They had cornered the helpless, exhausted daughter and were waiting for her to break. I looked down at the contract. $50,000. The price of my reputation, my dignity, and my grandmother's legacy. I reached out and picked up the fountain pen. Caspiel's shoulders visibly relaxed. A microscopic smirk played at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought I was still the broken woman crying in the freezing sleet. I didn't sign the paper. Instead, I used the tip of the heavy metal pen to push the contract back across the table, watching it slide until it bumped against Pierce's coffee cup. "No," I said quietly. Caspiel's smirk vanished. "Excuse me?" I looked directly into my father's eyes, allowing the pure, unadulterated contempt I felt for him to finally show on my face. "I am not signing your extortion papers, Caspiel, and I am not taking your hush money." "Vion, do not be an idiot," my mother snapped, her polite facade cracking instantly. "You have no money. You have no home. You are going to prison." "Am I?" I asked smoothly. I turned to Eleanor, who was sitting quietly to my left. She opened her battered briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy, red-bound medical file. She placed it on the table with a loud, satisfying thud. "Let's talk about your evidence, Mr. Pierce," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "You mentioned an affidavit from a medical staff member. I assume you are referring to Sarah Jenkins, a 22-year-old nursing intern from the Oakwood Agency." Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his poker face. "Ms. Jenkins was a first-hand witness to your client's horrific neglect." Ms. Jenkins was an intern who worked at the estate for precisely 19 days before being terminated for snooping through Talon Marlowe's financial documents, I corrected, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the room. And as an intern, her observational charts hold absolutely zero legal medical weight unless they are countersigned by the attending physician. I slid the heavy red file across the table toward Caspiel. "This," I continued, "is the official, original medical master file of Talon Marlowe provided to me yesterday by Dr. Alistair Reed, the chief of medicine at Hartford General. Dr. Reed examined my grandfather personally every single Friday. Inside that binder, you will find 400 pages of immaculately detailed notes, blood work, and physical evaluations, signed and dated by the chief of medicine himself, proving that Talon Marlowe received pristine, world-class care under my supervision." Caspiel stared at the red binder as if it were a bomb. He didn't reach for it. "Furthermore," Eleanor chimed in, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. She handed a single sheet of paper to Pierce. "This is a wire transfer receipt. 3 days after Sarah Jenkins was fired, a shell company registered to Alaris Marlowe's maiden name wired $95,000 into Sarah Jenkins' checking account. 2 days later, Ms. Jenkins purchased a Mercedes-Benz and signed an affidavit accusing Vion of abuse." The color rapidly drained from Alaris's face. She looked at Caspiel, sheer panic flashing in her eyes. "That is a bribe, Mr. Pierce," Harrison said, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "Subornation of perjury, falsifying medical records, extortion, fraud upon the court. My associate here has documented the entire money trail. It is airtight. Bradley Pierce, the slick, aggressive shark, suddenly looked like a man who had realized he was bleeding in the water. He stared at the wire transfer receipt, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked at Caspiel, pure fury in his eyes. Caspiel had lied to his own lawyer about the strength of the evidence. "If you do not withdraw the elder abuse petition by 5 o'clock today," I said, leaning over the table, bringing my face close to my father's, "I will hand this red binder, the wire transfer receipts, and the proof of the bribe directly to the district attorney. You won't just lose the estate, Caspiel. You and Mother will be sharing adjoining cells in a federal penitentiary." Caspiel's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. For 10 years, he had treated me like a pathetic, invisible servant. He had fundamentally miscalculated who I was. "You little bitch," Caspiel hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "We are done here," Harrison announced, snapping his briefcase shut and standing up. "Mr. Pierce, I expect the withdrawal notice on my desk by the end of the business day, and inform your clients that any further attempts to intimidate Ms. Marlowe will be met with immediate, catastrophic legal retaliation." I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. I looked down at my parents one last time. They looked small, pathetic, stripped of their power and their illusions. "Enjoy the house while you can," I told them, my voice perfectly steady, "because I'm coming for it, and I am coming for everything else." I turned and walked out of the glass conference room without looking back. Harrison and Eleanor flanked me, a silent, impenetrable guard. As the elevator doors closed, sealing us away from my parents' ruins, Harrison let out a low, appreciative chuckle. "Well, Vion," Harrison said, adjusting his tie, "I believe you just broke their jaw." "That was just the first punch," I replied, feeling a fierce, unstoppable fire burning in my chest. The terrified victim who had cried in the sleet was dead. Brisea Marlowe's granddaughter had arrived. "Now, Eleanor, tell me exactly how my grandmother hid the real money." By the time we returned to Harrison's high-rise office, the adrenaline that had carried me through the mediation had settled into a cold, diamond-hard focus. True to his word, Harrison's assistant handed him a faxed document exactly 45 minutes later. It was the official withdrawal of the elder abuse petition signed by Bradley Pierce. I was no longer facing prison. The threat of the Slayer statute was gone. My legal standing to challenge my grandfather's estate was fully restored. But as we gathered in Harrison's private conference room, now affectionately dubbed the War Room, the celebratory mood was brief. We had won a battle, but the war was still raging. Harrison took off his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and poured 3 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe. He slid one toward me. "Drink up, Vion. You've successfully removed the knife from your throat, but Caspiel is still holding the gun. As of right now, the forged will naming him the sole executor and beneficiary of the Marlowe estate is still actively making its way through probate court. If it passes probate, he gets the legal authority to liquidate everything," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug. "The estate, the house, the investment portfolios, all of it." "Precisely," Harrison said, pulling up a digital whiteboard on the wall monitor. "To stop him, we have to file an injunction to freeze the assets and formally contest the will on the grounds of undue influence and fraud. But judges are notoriously hesitant to freeze massive estates without concrete, overwhelming proof of financial malfeasance. We need to show the court why Caspiel forged that will." "Motive," Eleanor Sterling said, walking into the room with her laptop and a stack of freshly printed spreadsheets. She had been cloistered in a soundproof glass office for the last 4 hours, running Brisea's encrypted journal entries and the audit reports through her forensic software. She looked tired, but her gray eyes were practically glowing with an electric, manic energy. Eleanor plugged her laptop into the monitor. The whiteboard vanished, replaced by a sprawling, incredibly complex flowchart of corporate entities, trusts, and banking institutions. It looked less like a family's financial portfolio and more like the organizational chart of a multinational intelligence agency. "I have spent my entire 20-year career auditing the 1%, Eleanor began, pacing at the head of the table. "I have tracked hidden money through the Cayman Islands, Swiss holding companies, and shell corporations in Panama, but I have never seen anything as brilliantly, ruthlessly engineered as the Marlowe Trust." And she tapped a key, and a picture of my grandmother, Brisea Marlowe, appeared on the screen. It was an old photo I remembered from my childhood. She was sitting in a leather wingback chair wearing a simple string of pearls, her sharp, intelligent eyes staring directly into the camera. Your grandfather, Talon, was the face of the Marlowe Empire, Eleanor explained, turning to me. He shook the hands, he cut the ribbons, he gave the speeches. But he didn't build the engine. Your grandmother did. Brisea wasn't just a society wife. She had a mind for forensic wealth preservation that bordered on genius, and she used it to build a fortress. Fortress against who? I asked, though a sickening suspicion was already taking root in my gut. Against her own son, Eleanor said flatly. She clicked another button, and the flowchart zoomed in on a specific cluster of offshore LLCs. Brisea knew Caspiel was a narcissist with a lethal combination of arrogance and financial incompetence. She knew that if Caspiel ever got his hands on the principal capital of the Marlowe fortune, he would bankrupt the family in less than a decade. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. My parents had spent my entire life projecting an image of untouchable superiority. Caspiel was the sophisticated investor. Alaris was the ultimate patron of the arts. They had mocked my grandfather's conservative, old-school business methods. They had mocked me for my supposed lack of ambition. So, what did she do? Harrison asked, leaning forward, utterly captivated. She amputated him, Eleanor said, a fierce smirk crossing her face. 12 years ago, right before she died, Brazier restructured the entire estate. She transferred the core voting shares, the lucrative tech patents, and the primary real estate holdings, including the Connecticut mansion you lived in, into an irrevocable blind trust. Talon was the beneficiary during his lifetime, which is why he could pay for your living expenses and his medical care. But Caspiel was completely walled off. He couldn't touch the principal. He was only entitled to a modest, fixed annual dividend. Wait, I interrupted, my mind reeling. If Caspiel only had a fixed dividend, how did he and my mother afford their lifestyle? The penthouse in Manhattan, the chalets in Aspen, the custom Italian suits, they lived like billionaires. Eleanor's smirk faded into a grim, hard line. They lived like billionaires, Vion, because they were borrowing against a kingdom they didn't actually own. She brought up a new slide. This one was bathed in aggressive, glaring red ink. It was a list of commercial loans, mezzanine debt structures, and lines of credit from aggressive private equity firms. This is Caspiel's personal financial portfolio, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a solemn register. For the last 10 years, your father has been launching a series of commercial real estate ventures in Chicago and New York, luxury high-rises, boutique hotels, all of them spectacular, catastrophic failures. He has been hemorrhaging money for a decade. How much money? Harrison asked, his lawyer's intuition sensing blood in the water. $40 million, Eleanor stated, the number dropping into the quiet room like an anvil. The air rushed out of my lungs. $40 million. He's underwater, Eleanor continued, pointing at the red numbers. He leveraged his name and the illusion of the Marlowe wealth to secure massive loans from institutional lenders. But the capital calls are coming due. The grace periods have expired. Over the last 6 months, Caspiel has been desperately kiting checks, moving money from one failing LLC to another just to make the minimum interest payments. Alaris's charity galas, funded by debt. The designer clothes, bought on credit lines that are maxed out to the absolute limit. I slumped back in my chair, pressing my hands to my temples as the sheer magnitude of their deception washed over me. Everything was a lie. My parents weren't titans of industry. They were frauds. They were drowning in a self-made ocean of debt, putting on a dazzling theatrical performance of wealth while the bill collectors were literally pounding on the door. Now, Eleanor said, her gray eyes locking onto mine, let's look at the timeline. 6 weeks ago, Caspiel's largest lender in Chicago filed a private notice of intent to foreclose on his primary holding company. If that foreclosure goes public, Caspiel's entire house of cards collapses. The banks will audit him. The SEC will investigate his loan applications. When they realize he used fraudulent collateral locked in Brisea's blind trust, he won't just go bankrupt. He will be indicted for federal wire fraud and bank fraud. Prison? I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Federal prison, Harrison corrected smoothly. A mandatory minimum of 10 to 15 years. So, what does a desperate, cornered man do? Eleanor asked rhetorically, clicking to the final slide, a scanned copy of my grandfather's newly forged will. He visits his dying father. He brings a dirty notary and a corrupt lawyer. He forces the old man to sign a fake will, naming Caspiel the sole executor with the power to liquidate the estate, and the moment the old man dies, he throws the caregiver out into the street. I finished, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and pure, unadulterated fury. The pieces all fit together perfectly, forming a picture of sociopathic greed. They didn't kick me out that night just to be cruel. They kicked me out because they needed the house empty. They needed me gone, utterly stripped of resources and discredited by an elder abuse charge, so I couldn't slow them down. They need to sell the Connecticut estate and the tech patents immediately, Harrison concluded, connecting the final dots. They plan to hold a quiet, off-market fire sale, liquidate the assets, and use the cash to pay off the $40 million in debt before the FBI starts knocking on their penthouse door. They aren't just greedy, I said, staring at the red numbers on the screen. They are fighting for their survival. Which makes them incredibly dangerous, Harrison warned, his silver eyes serious. A cornered animal will chew its own leg off to escape a trap. Caspiel has nothing left to lose. If he manages to liquidate those assets before we get a judge to freeze them, the money will vanish into the Caymans to pay his creditors, and you will never see a dime of your grandfather's legacy. Then we freeze the assets, I said, sitting up straight, the fire burning hot in my chest. We take this financial data to the probate judge and we demand an immediate injunction. We can't, Eleanor interjected softly, closing her laptop. Not yet. I whipped my head toward her. Why not? You just proved he's committing fraud. I proved he has motive to commit fraud, Eleanor corrected gently. But Bricia's journals are 12 years old. And my forensic analysis of Caspiel's debt, while highly accurate, was obtained through back-channel audits that aren't technically admissible in court without a subpoena. If we go to a judge right now, Caspiel's lawyers will argue that his personal business debts have nothing to do with Talon's final wishes. They will wave that notarized, signed will in the judge's face. The will is the linchpin, Harrison agreed, running a hand through his graying hair. To freeze the estate, we have to prove definitively that the will is a forgery, or at the very least that Caspiel orchestrated a conspiracy to execute it under false pretenses. I told you, I said, frustration bleeding into my voice. He brought a lawyer and a notary into the house while I was at the pharmacy. It was a Tuesday afternoon. They were only there for 45 minutes. And that is the problem, Vion Parasis? Harrison said, leaning across the table. Look at the logistics. Your father lives in Manhattan. The estate is in Connecticut. You only left the house to go to the pharmacy for exactly 45 minutes. How did Caspiel know you would be gone? How did he manage to perfectly time his arrival with a lawyer and a notary, slip into Talon's bedroom, execute the document, and vanish before you returned? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I played the memory of that Tuesday back in my mind. My grandfather had taken a sudden turn for the worse that morning. I had called the pharmacy to rush a refill of his liquid morphine, but they said their delivery driver was out sick. I had to go pick it up myself. Before I left, I had made exactly one phone call to alert someone that I would be leaving my grandfather alone, just in case of an emergency. I had called the one man my grandfather still trusted to handle his immediate daily affairs. The man who managed the local bank branch. The man who had been a friend of the family for 30 years. Arthur, I whispered, the blood draining from my face. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Arthur Pendleton, the branch manager at Cumberland Trust? Yes, I breathed, my mind racing as a sickening wave of betrayal washed over me. I called Arthur that morning. I told him I had to leave the house to get the morphine. Arthur is the only one who knew the exact window of time the house would be empty. Eleanor's eyes widened. And Arthur Pendleton is the bank manager who controls the primary accounts where Talon's liquid cash sits. He's the one who verified the transfer protocols for Caspiel the morning after Talon died. He didn't just verify them, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. When I went to the bank to open box 402, Arthur tried to stop me. He tried to stall. He was terrified of what I might find in that box. Harrison let out a slow, sharp exhale. The seasoned lawyer saw the entire chessboard now. Arthur Pendleton isn't just a bystander, Vion. He is Caspiel's inside man. Caspiel couldn't execute this massive financial coup alone. He needed someone on the inside of the bank to bypass the security flags, suppress Brisea's proxy alerts, and coordinate the timing of the forged will. Arthur sold us out, I said, my hands clenching into tight fists on the table. Arthur had sat at our Thanksgiving table. He had patted my hand at the funeral and told me how devastated he was, all while helping my father orchestrate my absolute destruction. Every conspiracy has a weak link, Harrison said, a predatory glint returning to his eyes. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Caspiel is a sociopath. He won't crack. Alaris is entirely dependent on Caspiel's lies. She won't break either. But Arthur Pendleton? Arthur is a middle management banker who is used to playing golf on Sundays, not facing federal conspiracy charges. We go after Arthur, Eleanor said, a terrifying, beautiful smile spreading across her face. If we can prove Arthur took a payoff from Caspiel to facilitate the forgery and hide the assets, the forged will collapse instantly. Caspiel goes down. I looked at the flowchart on the screen. I looked at the $40 million of debt my parents had tried to bury me under. For 10 years, I had been the dutiful, obedient, silent daughter. I had let them walk all over me because I believed in the sanctity of family. But Brycia Marlowe had taught me the truth. When the wolves come, you don't reason with them. You build a trap. How do we break Arthur? I asked, looking up at Harrison. Harrison walked over to the whiteboard, picked up a black marker, and drew a thick circle around Arthur Pendleton's name. We don't just break him, Vion, Harrison said, his voice cold and precise. We are going to terrify him. We are going to make him believe Caspiel is throwing him under the bus. We are going to set a trap so flawless, Arthur Pendleton will walk into a deposition room and hand us Caspiel's head on a silver platter just to save his own skin. I took a deep breath, the exhaustion in my bones entirely replaced by the cold, bracing energy of vengeance. Tell me the plan. How do you catch a banker who spends his weekends playing golf with the men he helps commit fraud? Harrison asked, leaning against the edge of the conference table. The city lights of Hartford were beginning to flicker on outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the war room. You don't appeal to his conscience, Eleanor answered, not looking up from her laptop. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard with lethal precision. Arthur Pendleton doesn't have one. He has a 401k, a mortgage in the Hamptons, and an ego. If you want to trap a greedy man, you don't threaten him. You offer him a bigger piece of cheese. I watched the two of them work, entirely mesmerized by the surgical, bloodless way they approached the destruction of my family's empire. I had spent 10 years reacting to emergencies, a sudden drop in my grandfather's blood pressure, a missed medication, my mother's sudden, demanding phone calls. Now, for the first time in my 42 years, I was the one setting the board. Explain the cheese, I said, leaning forward. Eleanor spun her laptop around so I could see the screen. Displayed on it was a highly official-looking document bearing the letterhead of a notorious, ultra-private Swiss banking institution. The crest at the top was embossed. The signatures looked impeccably authentic. This, Eleanor said, tapping the screen, is a letter of direction for a numbered offshore account in Zurich. According to this document, Brycia Marlowe quietly deposited $15 million in untraceable bearer bonds into this vault 15 years ago. The stipulations state that upon Tolland's death, the funds are to be liquidated and transferred immediately to an encrypted holding account. I frowned, studying the document. I didn't see anything about a Zurich account in my grandmother's journals. That's because it doesn't exist, Harrison said, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. Eleanor just created it. It is what we in the intelligence and legal communities call a honeypot. A fabricated piece of bait so irresistible that your father won't be able to stop himself from taking a bite. Caspiel is drowning in $40 million of debt, Eleanor reminded me. His lenders are circling. He needs liquid cash and he needs it yesterday. If Caspiel thinks there is $15 million sitting in a Swiss vault, unattached to the primary estate and ripe for the picking, he will lose his mind trying to get his hands on it. But how does that break Arthur? I asked, trying to trace the logic. Because of how we deliver the bait, Harrison explained, picking up a printed copy of the fake Zurich document and sliding it into a manila folder. Tomorrow morning, you are going to walk into Cumberland Trust. You are going to look desperate. You are going to show this document to Arthur in strict, absolute confidence. You will tell him you found it hidden in the lining of Tolland's briefcase, and you need Arthur to initiate the international wire transfer to your private account immediately, before Caspiel's probate lawyers freeze the estate. The realization hit me like a physical shockwave. Arthur is Caspiel's inside man. The moment I leave the bank, Arthur is going to pick up the phone and call my father. Exactly, Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming. Arthur is a lapdog. He's already taken bribes from Caspiel to backdate security logs and facilitate the forged will. He will alert Caspiel about the $15 million to prove his loyalty and angle for a cut of the money. Harrison took over, pacing the length of the room, and Caspiel, being the arrogant, desperate narcissist that he is, will immediately instruct his lawyer, Bradley Pierce, to file an emergency ex parte motion with the probate court to seize the Zurich account. He will claim the money falls under his jurisdiction as the sole executor of the new will. He will sign a sworn affidavit declaring he has legal rights to an asset that does not exist. Perjury, I breathed. Perjury, Harrison confirmed. But more importantly, it proves conspiracy. The only way Caspiel could possibly know about the Zurich document is if Arthur Pendleton violated banking confidentiality and tipped him off. Once Caspiel files that motion, the trap snaps shut. I will subpoena Arthur for an emergency deposition regarding his handling of the estate. And when I get Arthur in a room, under oath, with Caspiel sitting right across from him, I am going to drop the guillotine. I looked at the manila folder resting on the mahogany table. It looked innocuous, just a few sheets of paper, but it was a loaded gun. I'll do it, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the fear that had ruled my life just 48 hours ago. I'll go to the bank when they open. The next morning, I made sure I looked the part of a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I wore the same coat I had worn when I was thrown out into the sleet. I skipped my morning coffee so my hands would have a natural caffeine withdrawal tremor. I didn't brush my hair. When I walked into the hushed marble lobby of Cumberland Trust, Arthur Pendleton was sitting at his desk, sipping an espresso and reviewing a quarterly report. When he saw me, his posture stiffened. The polite, patronizing mask slipped into place. "Vion," Arthur said, standing up. "I must admit, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I heard about the unpleasantness at the mediation yesterday. I am so sorry things have become so contentious between you and your parents." He was lying through his teeth. He knew exactly what had happened. "Arthur, I need your help," I whispered, injecting a frantic, breathless panic into my voice. I leaned over his desk, glancing around the lobby as if I were being followed. "Please, I don't have anywhere else to go. Caspiel is trying to freeze me out of everything. He's going to leave me with nothing." Arthur's eyes softened with mock sympathy. "My dear, my hands are tied. Caspiel has presented a legally binding will to the probate court. Until the judge rules on your contestation, all of Tolland's primary accounts are locked." "Not all of them," I said. I pulled the manila folder from my bag and slid it across the polished wood of his desk. I opened it, revealing the embossed crest of the Swiss bank. Arthur looked down. His eyes scanned the letter of direction. I watched his pupils dilate. The amount, $15 million in bearer bonds, jumped off the page. He froze, his breathing hitching just a fraction of a second. The greed in his eyes was naked, raw, and undeniable. "Where did you find this?" Arthur asked, his voice suddenly very quiet. "I found it sewn into the lining of my grandfather's old leather briefcase," I lied, keeping my voice shaky. "Arthur, this account predates the new will. It was set up by my grandmother. The funds are supposed to transfer automatically upon Tolland's death. You're the branch manager. You have the international clearing codes. You have to initiate the transfer for me today. Please." "If Caspiel finds out about this, he'll find a way to take it too." Arthur stared at the document. I could practically see the gears grinding in his head. He was calculating his own leverage. He was calculating his cut. "Vion," Arthur said, slowly closing the folder and sliding it back to me. He offered a deeply apologetic, sorrowful smile. "International transfers of this magnitude require a mandatory 72-hour holding period for compliance and anti-money laundering checks. I cannot push a button and make $15 million appear in your checking account today." "But you can start the process?" I pleaded. "You can keep it off the main ledger so Caspiel's lawyers don't see it?" "I will see what I can do to expedite the paperwork," Arthur said, his tone slick with false reassurance. "Leave a copy of the document with me. I will contact the Zurich branch through our secure channels. But you must not tell anyone about this, Vion. Let me handle it." "Thank you, Arthur," I breathed, letting out a heavy, theatrical sigh of relief. "You're the only one I can trust." I turned and walked out of the bank. The moment the heavy revolving doors deposited me onto the cold city sidewalk, I dropped the panicked facade. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Harrison's direct line. "The bait is in the water," I said, my voice ice cold. "Excellent," Harrison replied, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing in the background. Eleanor is monitoring the county court docket right now. Let's see how long it takes for your father to bite. And it took exactly 4 hours. At 2:15 p.m., Eleanor's tracking software pinged. Bradley Pierce, acting on behalf of Caspiel Marlowe, filed an emergency ex parte motion with the probate court. The motion demanded the immediate seizure and freezing of a previously undisclosed Swiss holding account on the grounds that it was the rightful property of the estate's executor. Caspiel had signed a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury, claiming he had independent knowledge of the account's existence prior to Tollin's death. They had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. Got him, Eleanor whispered, staring at the screen in the war room. Harrison stood up, his silver eyes flashing with predatory anticipation. He hit the intercom button on his desk. Sharon, draft a subpoena for Arthur Pendleton. I want him in my deposition room tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Cite the emergency ex parte motion filed by Caspiel Marlowe as the grounds for inquiry. Harrison turned to me, a fierce, terrifying smile on his face. Get some sleep tonight, Vion. Tomorrow, we burn them down. The deposition room at Vance & Associates was designed for psychological warfare. It was a sterile, windowless rectangle located in the center of the building. The walls were painted a stark, unforgiving white. The temperature was kept uncomfortably cold. A long, rectangular glass table dominated the space, with a court reporter sitting quietly in the corner, her fingers hovering over her stenograph machine. I sat next to Harrison, wearing my tailored black suit. Eleanor sat behind us, her laptop open, acting as our silent artillery. At 8:55 a.m., the door opened. Arthur Pendleton walked in first, accompanied by a junior lawyer the bank had provided. Arthur looked slightly annoyed, but overall, he exuded the confident irritation of a busy man summoned for a routine procedural matter. He still thought he was the smartest guy in the room. A moment later, Caspiel and Alaris walked in, flanked by Bradley Pierce. My father looked absolutely triumphant. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He thought this deposition was a formality. He thought Harrison had panicked after seeing the ex parte motion for the $15 million and was desperately trying to figure out how Caspiel had found the money. They all took their seats across from us. The air in the room was thick, practically crackling with unspoken hostility. Let's go on the record, Harrison said smoothly, nodding to the court reporter. The reporter swore Arthur in. Arthur raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help him God. Mr. Pendleton, Harrison began, his voice calm, conversational. He leaned back in his chair, twirling a silver pen between his fingers. You are the branch manager of Cumberland Trust, correct? You personally oversaw the accounts of the late Tollin Marlowe. I did, Arthur replied smoothly, for over 20 years. Tollin was a dear friend. A dear friend, Harrison repeated, letting the words hang in the freezing air. And as a dear friend, you were acutely aware of his medical decline over the last few years. You were aware that his granddaughter, my client Vion Marlowe, was his sole full-time caregiver? I was aware, Arthur said, shifting slightly in his leather chair. Now, Mr. Pendleton, let's discuss the events of Tuesday, November 12th, exactly 6 weeks ago, the day Caspiel Marlowe presented a newly drafted will to Tollin Marlowe for his signature. Harrison pulled a calendar from his file and laid it on the table. On that morning, at 9:15 a.m., my client, Vion Marlowe, called your direct line at the bank. Do you recall that conversation? Arthur's eyes darted toward Caspiel for a fraction of a second before returning to Harrison. I receive dozens of calls a day, Mr. Vance. I don't recall the specifics of that one. Let me refresh your memory, Harrison said, his voice sharpening slightly. She called to tell you she had to leave the Marlowe estate to pick up liquid morphine from a pharmacy in the next town. She told you the house would be completely empty, save for a bedridden Tollin, for exactly 45 minutes. Did she not? I believe she may have mentioned running an errand, yes, Arthur hedged. Interesting, Harrison noted, because toll records obtained from the State Highway Authority show Caspiel Marlowe's vehicle crossing the county line at 8:30 a.m. that morning. He arrived at the Marlowe estate at exactly 9:45 a.m., 30 minutes after Vion called you. He brought a lawyer and a notary. They executed a complete transfer of a $100 million estate in 15 minutes and vanished before Vion returned. It was a perfectly timed surgical strike. Bradley Pierce slammed his hand on the table. Objection! This is entirely speculative. My client's visit to his dying father was a coincidence. You are harassing the witness. I am establishing a timeline, Mr. Pierce, Harrison countered, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. He turned his eyes back to Arthur. Mr. Pendleton, did you, at any point on the morning of November 12th, communicate with Caspiel Marlowe to inform him that Vion was leaving the house? Absolutely not, Arthur said, lifting his chin indignantly. That would be a severe breach of protocol. You are under oath, Arthur, Harrison reminded him gently. I just want to be clear. You did not tip off Caspiel Marlowe. I did not. Harrison nodded slowly. Very well. Let's move to the matter of the emergency ex parte motion filed yesterday afternoon by Caspiel Marlowe. Harrison picked up a copy of the motion and slid it across the glass table. Caspiel swore under penalty of perjury that he had independent prior knowledge of a $15 million Zurich bearer bond account belonging to the estate. Mr. Pendleton, have you ever seen the document detailing the Zurich account? Arthur smiled, a smug, self-satisfied expression. He thought he was walking into a setup he had already outsmarted. Yes, Vion brought it into my branch yesterday morning. She was quite hysterical. She asked me to wire the funds to her private account. Caspiel smirked, leaning back in his chair. He shot me a look of pure contempt. He thought he had caught me trying to steal from him. And what did you do after Vion showed you the document, Arthur? Harrison asked. I informed her that international transfers require compliance checks, Arthur said, playing the role of the dutiful banker perfectly. And then, as is my fiduciary duty to the designated executor of the estate, I immediately contacted Caspiel to inform him of the hidden asset. So you called Caspiel yesterday at 10:30 a.m. to tell him about the Zurich account? Yes, Arthur said proudly. Harrison stopped twirling his pen. The conversational tone vanished, replaced by an absolute terrifying silence. Harrison looked at Arthur, then at Caspiel, and finally at Bradley Pierce. That is fascinating, Harrison said softly, because the Zurich account does not exist. The smug smile slid off Arthur's face. Caspiel sat bolt upright, his brow furrowing in confusion. What are you talking about? Bradley Pierce demanded. I am talking about a honeypot, Mr. Pierce, Harrison said, his voice echoing off the stark white walls. Eleanor hit a button on her laptop, and a projection screen dropped down at the end of the room. It displayed the letter of direction Vion had given Arthur. My forensic accounting team fabricated that document 48 hours ago, Harrison stated, his words hitting the room like physical blows. There is no Zurich account. There are no bearer bonds. It is a piece of fiction, created legally by my firm to test the integrity of Cumberland Trust's branch manager. And you all failed spectacularly. Caspiel's face went completely white. Alaris gasped, her hand flying to her throat. You set us up! Caspiel roared, half rising from his chair. Sit down, Caspiel, Harrison commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. You signed a sworn affidavit yesterday claiming you had prior knowledge of a fake account to justify seizing it. You committed perjury on a federal court filing. That is a felony. But you couldn't help yourself, could you? You are $40 million in debt, your lenders are foreclosing, and you are desperate for cash. Arthur looked like he had been struck by lightning. He stared at the projection screen, his mouth opening and closing silently. He realized, with horrifying clarity, what had just happened. He had admitted on the record to colluding with Caspiel regarding a fake document. But we aren't here for Caspiel's perjury, Harrison continued, turning his predatory gaze back to Arthur. We are here for you, Arthur, because the fake Zurich document wasn't the only thing my forensic accountant found. Eleanor hit another button on her laptop. The fake document vanished from the screen. In its place appeared a complex, highly encrypted banking ledger. Red circles highlighted a series of wire transfers. Let's talk about a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands called Apex Consulting, Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave. A corporation owned by your brother-in-law, Arthur. A corporation that received a wire transfer of $250,000 from one of Caspiel Marlowe's failing real estate LLCs on November 13th, exactly 1 day after the forged will was signed. Arthur's breath hitched. A fine sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead. The junior lawyer sitting next to him suddenly looked terrified, desperately whispering into Arthur's ear to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights. That was a consulting fee, Caspiel stammered, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. For real estate advisement. Shut up, Caspiel, Harrison snapped, not even looking at him. His eyes remained locked on Arthur like a sniper looking through a scope. Arthur, I have the IP logs showing you manually overriding the Brizia Marlowe proxy alerts in Cumberland Trust's internal system. I have the wire transfers proving you took $250,000 in bribes. I have you on the record admitting you tipped Caspiel off about a honeypot asset. Harrison leaned across the glass table, bringing his face inches from the terrified banker. You committed wire fraud, bank fraud, subornation of perjury, and conspiracy to defraud a legal heir, Harrison listed, ticking the crimes off on his fingers. The FBI will be at your house in the Hamptons by dinner time. They will seize your 401k. They will freeze your assets. You are looking at 20 years in federal prison, Arthur. You are going to die in a concrete cell. Arthur was hyperventilating. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big. He looked at Caspiel, desperate for a lifeline, but Caspiel was staring at the table, his face a mask of absolute paralyzing panic. Caspiel wasn't going to save him. Caspiel was drowning too. I can offer you a life raft, Arthur, Harrison whispered, his voice dangerously soft. But you have to get on it right now, in front of this court reporter. You tell me the truth about the forged will, you tell me the truth about Caspiel's conspiracy, and I will hand this file to the federal prosecutor with a recommendation for full immunity in exchange for your testimony as a state's witness. Objection! You cannot threaten a witness! Bradley Pierce yelled, though his voice cracked in panic. He realized his client was going down, and he was dangerously close to being implicated in the fallout. Harrison ignored him. He didn't blink. He just stared at Arthur. 5 seconds, Arthur, Harrison said. 5, 4, 3, 2. He paid me! Arthur screamed, his voice cracking, tears of sheer terror welling in his eyes. The dam broke. The polished banker shattered into a million pieces. Caspiel paid me! Arthur, shut your mouth, Caspiel roared, lunging across the table. I didn't flinch. I sat perfectly still, watching the man who had tormented me for a decade finally break apart. He called me in October, Arthur babbled, weeping openly now, ignoring his own lawyer who was frantically trying to silence him. He said he was going bankrupt. He said Brizia had locked him out of the principal and he needed to break the trust. He paid me $250,000 to backdate the bank's security protocols and suppress the proxy alerts so the court wouldn't know the estate was tied up in a blind trust. And the morning of the forgery? Harrison pressed, ruthless, driving the final nail into the coffin. He told me to call him the second Vion left the house, Arthur sobbed, burying his face in his hands. I called him at 9:16 a.m. He had the notary waiting in a car a mile down the road. They went in, forced Tollin's hand onto the paper, and left. It was all Caspiel. He planned the whole thing. He told me we had to ruin Vion so she couldn't fight back. The deposition room fell into a stunned, ringing silence, broken only by Arthur Pendleton's pathetic, ragged sobbing. I slowly turned my head and looked at my parents. Alaris was shaking uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, her designer makeup ruined by tears of sheer, unadulterated terror. The illusion of her high society life had just evaporated into thin air. But Caspiel looked at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a horror he had never experienced before. He wasn't looking at the pathetic, invisible caregiver anymore. He was looking at the woman who had just slit his throat without spilling a single drop of blood. It's over, Caspiel, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But in the quiet room, it sounded like a gunshot. Harrison calmly turned to the court reporter. We have what we need. End the record. Harrison stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked down at Bradley Pierce, who looked like he was about to vomit. Mr. Pierce, I expect Caspiel's formal withdrawal of the forged will and a total surrender of the estate executor rights by noon. If it isn't on my desk, the FBI gets the unedited transcript of this deposition at 12:01 p.m. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my black suit, and walked toward the door. I didn't look back at my parents. They were already ghosts. The trap had sprung. The wolves were dead. But Brizia Marlowe's masterpiece wasn't quite finished yet. There was still the matter of the poison pill. The clock on the wall of the war room ticked with the agonizing slowness of a bomb timer. It was 11:45 a.m. We had 15 minutes until Harrison's deadline expired. 15 minutes until the unedited transcript of Arthur Pendleton's tear-soaked confession would automatically be forwarded to the United States Attorney's Office. I sat at the mahogany table, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray Hartford skyline. I felt a strange, terrifying calm. For 10 years, my life had been dictated by the whims and demands of my parents. Now they were the ones watching the clock, trapped in a cage of their own making. At 11:52 a.m., Harrison's fax machine whirred to life. Harrison walked over, pulling the crisp sheets of paper from the tray. He scanned the first page, his silver eyes narrowing. It's from Bradley Pierce, a formal withdrawal of the forged will and a complete surrender of Caspiel's executor rights. Pierce has also formally recused himself as their legal counsel, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. The rat is fleeing the sinking ship, Eleanor murmured, not looking up from her monitors. Pierce knows Caspiel committed perjury. If he stays on as counsel, he goes down for subornation of fraud. We won, I breathed, the sheer weight of the last few weeks lifting off my chest. The forged will is dead. He can't touch the estate. But Harrison didn't smile. He stared at the second page of the fax, a deep, ominous frown carving lines into his forehead. Pierce withdrew the will, but Caspiel didn't sign the surrender. What do you mean? I asked, the brief moment of relief evaporating. Pierce signed it as his attorney of record, but Caspiel's physical signature is missing from the executor renunciation form, Harrison explained, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp, dangerous register. Caspiel went rogue. He fired Pierce and refused to sign. And suddenly, Eleanor's laptop began to emit a rapid, piercing series of digital chimes. Harrison, Eleanor said, her voice laced with sudden, absolute urgency. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard, pulling up screens of encrypted banking data. I left a tracking algorithm on Cumberland Trust's internal ledger after we broke Arthur this morning. Someone is bypassing the standard clearing protocols. A massive, unauthorized liquidation order just hit the system. From who? Harrison demanded, rushing to her side of the table. From Caspiel, Eleanor said, her gray eyes wide with disbelief. He's using his title as the CEO of the Marlowe Holding Company. Because the withdrawal of the forged will hasn't been formally processed by a judge yet, Caspiel technically still has 30 minutes of executive authority. He is executing a scorched earth fire sale. A sale of what? I asked, my heart hammering in my chest. The core tech patents, Eleanor said, bringing up a digital bill of sale. He's selling the crown jewels of the Marlowe Empire to a rival conglomerate out of Singapore for pennies on the dollar. $60 million in liquid cash, set to be wired directly into an untraceable offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. He isn't trying to pay his debts anymore, Vion. He's liquidating the portfolio and running. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me. If that wire goes through, if that wire hits the Caymans, the money is gone forever, Harrison said, pulling his suit jacket back on with brutal efficiency. It will take international courts a decade to untangle it, and Caspiel will spend the rest of his life living like a king in a non-extradition country, completely untouchable. He's signing the final transfer documents at the Marlowe corporate headquarters right now, Eleanor confirmed, tracking the IP address of the digital signature request. The Singaporean buyers are in the boardroom with him. If he inks that contract, the wire clears automatically. I felt the panic rising, hot and suffocating. After everything we had done, the journal, the honeypot, the deposition, he was going to slip through our fingers out of sheer narcissistic desperation. He was going to burn my grandmother's legacy to ashes just to keep his hands warm. We have to call the police. We have to stop him, I shouted, grabbing my coat. No, Eleanor said softly. Harrison and I both stopped, turning to look at her. Eleanor wasn't panicking. She was staring at her screen, and a slow, terrifying, magnificent smile was spreading across her face. She reached into her battered leather briefcase and pulled out the very last page of Brizia Marlowe's journal. Your grandmother was a genius, Vion, Eleanor whispered, her eyes shining with absolute awe. She didn't just build a fortress, she built a guillotine. Eleanor slid the page across the table. I finally decrypted the final clause of the Blind Trust Charter. I couldn't understand it until now. It's a corporate defense mechanism known as a poison pill, a shareholder rights plan designed to prevent a hostile takeover, but Brycia weaponized it against her own son. To explain, Harrison said, his legal mind immediately locking onto the concept. Brizia knew that if Caspiel ever felt cornered, he would try to liquidate the core assets and run. Eleanor explained, tapping the journal page. So, she hardwired a trap into the foundational articles of incorporation. The clause states that any attempt by Caspiel Marlowe to liquidate, sell, or transfer more than 10% of the holding company's core assets without the physical, notarized countersignature of Vion Marlowe is classified as an act of corporate treason. My breath hitched. What happens if he signs it without me? Harrison's eyes went wide as he read the clause over Eleanor's shoulder. He let out a breathless, predatory laugh. The poison pill activates. The moment his pen touches that paper, the corporate charter automatically and instantly dissolves the entire board of directors. It strips Caspiel of all executive titles, nullifies his shares, and vests 100% of the voting rights and corporate control directly to you, Vion. But what about the sale? I asked. What about the $60 million? The sale becomes legally void the millisecond he signs it because he ceases to be the CEO the moment he attempts the transaction, Harrison explained, the adrenaline radiating off him in waves. But the Singaporean buyers won't know that. They will wire the $60 million into the Marlowe corporate accounts completely legally. And the crime? Eleanor added, her smile lethal. By signing a fraudulent bill of sale to foreign investors for an asset he legally surrendered the right to sell, Caspiel commits international wire fraud and grand larceny in real time. I looked at the clock. It was 11:58 a.m. We don't want to stop him from signing that contract, I realized, the ice returning to my veins. We want him to sign it. Grab your coat, Vion, Harrison ordered, picking up his phone and dialing a number I didn't recognize. Eleanor, print that clause. Vion and I are going to the Marlowe building. I'm calling my contacts at the FBI field office. We are going to let Caspiel Marlowe dig his own grave, and then we are going to push him in. The Marlowe corporate headquarters was a sleek, imposing monolith of glass and steel in the center of the financial district. When Harrison and I strode through the revolving doors, we were flanked by 3 federal agents in dark windbreakers. Harrison had called in every favor he had collected over 30 years of practicing law. The FBI was deeply interested in a man who had committed perjury, bribed a bank manager, and was currently attempting $60 million worth of wire fraud. We bypassed the receptionist and stepped into the private executive elevator. The silence during the ride to the top floor was electric. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel doors. The exhausted, beaten-down caregiver was entirely gone. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. We walked down the plush carpeted hallway toward the primary boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see them. Caspiel sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, his suit slightly wrinkled, sweat beading on his forehead. Alara sat next to him, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. Across from them sat 3 executives from the Singaporean conglomerate, their lawyers carefully reviewing a towering stack of contracts. I pushed the heavy glass doors open. The low hum of conversation in the boardroom snapped to a halt. Caspiel's head jerked up. When he saw me, accompanied by Harrison and 3 federal agents, the remaining color drained completely from his face. What is the meaning of this? Caspiel demanded, though his voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. He stood up, trying to project authority, but he looked like a ghost. This is a closed executive session. Security! Cancel the security call, Caspiel, Harrison said smoothly, walking into the room with the absolute authority of an executioner. They won't be coming. The building is currently being secured by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Singaporean executives exchanged alarmed glances, their lawyers immediately stepping back from the table. You have no jurisdiction here, Vance, Caspiel spat, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. I am the CEO of this company. I am finalizing a legally binding asset transfer. You are trespassing. Did you sign the contract, Caspiel? I asked, my voice cutting through the panic in the room like a blade. Caspiel sneered at me, a desperate, feral look in his eyes. He reached down, grabbed the final page of the contract, and held it up. His signature was slashed across the bottom line in bold black ink. I signed it 2 minutes ago, Caspiel gloated, a manic, breathless laugh escaping his lips. The wire transfer has already been initiated. The money is in transit. You're too late, Vion. You get nothing. I beat you. Alaris let out a shaky sigh of relief, offering me a look of pure, venomous triumph. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the man who had tormented me, manipulated me, and tried to destroy my life, and I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. He was so blindingly arrogant, he had never even bothered to read the fine print of his own mother's trust. You didn't beat anyone, Caspiel, I said softly. Harrison opened his briefcase, pulled out the document Eleanor had printed, and dropped it onto the obsidian table right in front of the Singaporean lawyers. Gentlemen, Harrison addressed the foreign buyers, his tone perfectly professional. I advise you to immediately contact your banking institution and freeze that wire transfer. The man standing before you is not the CEO of the Marlowe Holding Company. He has absolutely no legal authority to sell you those patents. That is a lie, Caspiel roared. I am the executor. I am the chairman of the board. You were the chairman, Harrison corrected coldly, until 2 minutes ago. According to Article 7, Section 4 of the Brycia Marlowe Irrevocable Blind Trust, any attempt by Caspiel Marlowe to liquidate core assets without the countersignature of Vion Marlowe automatically triggers a poison pill dissolution. Harrison tapped the paper on the table. The millisecond your pen touched that contract, Caspiel, your shares were nullified. The board was dissolved. You fired yourself. The patents you just sold currently belong entirely to my client, Vion Marlowe. The lead Singaporean lawyer quickly scanned the document Harrison had provided. His eyes widened in shock. He immediately pulled his phone out and began shouting in Mandarin to his banking team. No, Caspiel whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. No, that's impossible. My mother wouldn't do that. She knew exactly what you were, Caspiel, I said, stepping forward until I was just a few feet away from him. She knew you were a coward. She knew you were a thief. She left you a gilded cage, and you were too stupid to realize the door was locked. You fraudulent bastard, the Singaporean executive hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my father. You tried to steal $60 million from us. Special Agent Davis, Harrison said, turning to the lead FBI agent, I believe you have an arrest warrant for the former CEO. The agent stepped forward, their movements swift and practiced. Caspiel Marlowe, Agent Davis said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. It was the ultimate narcissistic collapse. Caspiel didn't fight, he didn't yell, his knees simply gave out. He collapsed into the leather executive chair, staring blankly ahead as the federal agent roughly pulled his arms behind his back and secured the handcuffs. The sharp click of the metal locking into place echoed like a gavel strike in the silent boardroom. Caspiel! Alaris shrieked, jumping up from her chair. The illusion of her flawless poise shattered completely. She looked around wildly, realizing that the empire was gone, the money was gone, and the penthouse was about to be seized by the feds. She turned to me. Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears. She fell to her knees, grasping at the hem of my coat. Vion, please, my mother sobbed, her voice a desperate, pathetic wail. You have to stop this. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. We are your family. I'm your mother. You can't let them take us away. Please, my baby, please. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I remembered the night in the sleet. I remember the absolute coldness in her eyes when she told me I had nowhere to go. I remembered the $40 motel room, the sheer terror of facing federal prison for a crime I didn't commit, and the 10 years I had spent sacrificing my youth for a family that viewed me as disposable garbage. I reached down and gently, firmly, peeled her manicured fingers off my coat. You aren't my mother, I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any anger or sorrow. You were just the woman who lived in my grandfather's house. I was your servant. But I am Brycia Marlowe's granddaughter. I stepped back. Take them away. Alaris began to scream hysterically as a female agent pulled her to her feet and slapped cuffs on her wrists. Caspiel was hauled up, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man, his eyes vacant and dead. I turned my back on them. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city. I didn't watch as they were dragged out of the boardroom, their protests echoing down the hallway until the heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the sound entirely. The storm was over. The wolves were gone. Harrison walked up to stand beside me, looking out at the skyline. He let out a long, quiet exhale. It's going to take months to untangle the mess he made of the corporate accounts. Harrison noted softly. The probate court will officially instate you as the sole executor by Friday. The Connecticut estate is yours. The patents are yours. The blind trust is yours. You are the head of the Marlowe family now, Vion. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I looked older than 42, yes. But I also looked unbroken. For the first time in my life, I looked dangerous. Call Eleanor, I said, a genuine quiet smile finally touching my lips. Tell her to double her retainer. We have an empire to rebuild. 6 months later, the freezing sleet of that terrible winter was nothing but a distant memory. The Connecticut estate was bathed in the golden, warm light of late summer. I stood in the grand mahogany library holding a cup of tea. The room didn't smell like pipe tobacco and illness anymore. It smelled like fresh lemon polish and the sprawling bouquets of hydrangeas I had cut from the garden that morning. Caspiel and Alaris were gone. They had both pled guilty to avoid a drawn-out federal trial. Caspiel was sentenced to 15 years in a minimum security federal facility. Alaris received 7 years as an accessory. The tabloids had a field day with the spectacular fall of the Marlowe socialites, but I didn't read the articles. They were no longer a part of my reality. Arthur Pendleton had struck his immunity deal, but the scandal had ruined him. He was permanently stripped of his banking license and was currently working as a shift manager at a hardware store in upstate New York. As for me, I didn't sell the house. I kept it. I took over the holding company, fired the dead weight Caspiel had hired, and installed Eleanor as my chief financial officer. Under our combined leadership, the Marlowe Trust wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. I had launched a philanthropic foundation in my grandfather's name, dedicated to providing free legal and financial advocacy for victims of elder abuse. I walked over to the massive oak desk that had once belonged to Tallinn and to Brisea before him. I opened the top drawer. Resting inside, right next to Brisea's leather journal, was the heavy, rusted brass key. I ran my thumb over the cold metal. They had tried to bury me. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, my sanity, and my future. But they had forgotten one fundamental truth about the women in this family. We do not break. We adapt, we learn, and when the time is right, we take back exactly what belongs to us. If you are listening to this and you feel trapped, unseen, or underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you, remember this story. Your kindness is not a weakness. Your sacrifices are not invisible. And when you finally decide to stand up and fight for your own life, you might just be surprised by how much power you truly hold. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this journey. If this story resonated with you, please hit the subscribe button and join our community. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I read every single one. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.